On the night of the 31st of December 1953, in a cabin aboard the French liner Columbia in the North Atlantic, a woman sat beside a man who was bleeding to death. The ship's doctor had been called. There was nothing adequate to hand. No surgeon, no hospital, no equipment beyond what a passenger vessel carried for seasickness and minor complaints. The man was 63. He had been a cabinet minister, a wartime ambassador, a man who had resigned from government on principle when the rest of his colleagues bent to a dictator. His wife held a room the way she had held rooms for 40 years, silently, completely. Somewhere else on the ship, passengers were counting down to midnight. Champagne corks, laughter, a new year. In the cabin, the old year bled out, and so did he. Alfred Duff Cooper, 1st Viscount Norwich, died on the 1st of January 1954. His wife Diana was 61. She was alone on a ship full of strangers, and the partnership that had defined her life was over. The public would remember her as one of the most celebrated women of her century, a duke's daughter, a famous beauty, the hostess who had reopened the British embassy and liberated Paris. They would not know what it had cost. They would not know about the debts behind the glamour, the infidelities absorbed in silence, or the private code that held the whole construction together. This is the story of a woman born inside one of Britain's grandest names, a marriage that was as dangerous as it was brilliant, and a world that believed beauty and rank were permanent facts. It is the story of what happened when those facts stopped being true, and of the woman who outlived them all. But to understand how Diana Cooper ended up on that ship, watching the last fixed point in her life slip away between two ports, you have to go back. Not just to the marriage, not just to the embassies and the war and the famous face that launched 1,000 invitations. You have to go back to a castle in Leicestershire, to a family that assumed the old world would always be there, and to a woman who was born inside one of Britain's grandest names and spent the rest of her life discovering what a name could and could not protect. This is the story of a dynasty that believed beauty, rank, and access were permanent facts, and of the woman who outlived the system that made those facts function. It is the story of a generation annihilated, a marriage that was brilliant and perilous in equal measure, an empire that dissolved while its social custodians were still holding dinner parties, and a widow who survived by turning herself into the chief memorialist of her own vanished world. It begins, as these stories always do, with a house. Belvoir Castle sits above the Vale of Belvoir in Leicestershire, and it has sat there, in one form or another, since the Norman conquest. The name is French, the pronunciation is English. Say it wrong, and you have announced in a single word that you do not belong to the world that built it. The Manors family came into possession of Belvoir through marriage in the 16th century, and across 400 years of English upheaval. Civil war, revolution, industrial transformation, the slow grinding of reform, they held it. The house burned and was rebuilt. Titles accumulated. The family married well, governed locally, sat in parliament, entertained royalty, and did what the English aristocracy has always done best, endured. By the late 19th century, the Duke of Rutland's seat at Belvoir was not simply a country house. It was a statement of continuity so deep that the people who lived inside it could be forgiven for believing that history itself was on their side. That belief mattered. It shaped everything that followed. And it was not merely abstract. It was built into the physical fabric of daily life. The world Diana Manners was born into in 1892 was one in which a great house was not merely a residence, but an instrument of authority, and Belvoir was among the most imposing instruments in England. The castle's Gothic revival silhouette, rebuilt after a devastating fire in 1816, announced itself across the Vale with the confidence of a family that had survived catastrophe before and assumed it would again. Inside, the rooms were arranged with a deliberateness that went beyond decoration. Belvoir had its servants, dozens of them, arranged in their own hierarchy that mirrored the families from the butler and housekeeper at the apex to the lowest scullery maid. Its rituals of morning and evening, its hierarchy of corridors and staircases that told you, without anyone needing to say it, exactly where you stood. A guest could read the house like a social map. The rooms you were invited into, the staircase you were directed to, the hour at which your breakfast tray arrived, all of it communicated rank, favor, and proximity to the family with a precision that words would have made vulgar. The family moved between Belvoir and their London house according to the rhythms of the season. Ascot, Henley, the presentations at court, the balls and dinners and weekends that were not recreation, but governance conducted by other means. The great houses of England operated as a network: Chatsworth, Blenheim, Woburn, Hatfield, Belvoir. Each one was a node in a social system that still functioned, still commanded deference, still assumed that the people born inside these walls were the natural rulers of the country and, by extension, of a quarter of the globe. If you were the daughter of a duke, you did not simply attend these events. You were, in a sense, produced by them. Your beauty was an asset. Your conversation was a skill. Your marriage was a negotiation. And the assumption, shared by everyone in this world, was that the system would go on producing women like you and men to match indefinitely. There is something about that assumption worth sitting with for a moment, because it was not foolish. It was not even, by the standards of the time, unreasonable. The great English estates had survived the Reformation, the Commonwealth, the agricultural depressions of the 1870s and 1880s. They had bent, they had not broken. When Diana was a child, the liberal reforms that would begin to redistribute power were underway but had not yet become existential. The Parliament Act of 1911 would clip the Lord's veto. Lloyd George's budgets would start the long fiscal assault on landed wealth. Death duties, introduced in 1894, would compound across generation until the arithmetic of inheritance became impossible for families whose wealth was locked in land and stone. English heritage has documented the long erosion. Roughly 4,000 country houses demolished between 1875 and 1975, many of them casualties of rising taxation, falling agricultural income, and the slow withdrawal of the political class from the land. But in 1892, the demolitions were still ahead. The taxation was still modest. Belvoir looked permanent. That was the first lesson of Diana's childhood, and it was the one that would prove most dangerously wrong. The household she entered was governed by two figures who, between them, contained most of the forces that would shape her life. Her legal father was Henry Manors, the 8th Duke of Rutland. He was the bearer of the house's public authority, title, estate, expectation, precedence, and he occupied that role with the quiet solidity of a man who understood that personal feeling was secondary to dynastic appearance. He was not a tyrant. He was not a fool. He was, by the accounts that survive, a decent man doing what decent men of his class did, maintaining. He managed the estate, he fulfilled his duties, he represented in his person the idea that the family's function was to continue, to present, to hold the line. What happened behind the presentation was managed by silence. The Duke was not the kind of man who asked difficult questions, because in his world, difficult questions were not asked. They were absorbed. His wife, Violet, Duchess of Rutland, was a different kind of force entirely. She was born Violet Lindsay, the daughter of a man connected to the arts and to politics, and she brought to Belvoir a quality that the house had not, perhaps, expected: creative intensity. Violet painted, she sculpted. She moved through the world of the late Victorian and Edwardian aristocracy with the particular confidence of a woman who was both insider and artist, both duchess and maker. She filled Belvoir with an atmosphere that was at once formal and alive, where beauty was cultivated as deliberately as the gardens, where the conversation at dinner was expected to be as accomplished as the silver on the table. Violet was not merely decorative, she was an architect of atmosphere, and the atmosphere she built was one in which charm, wit, physical grace, and the ability to hold a room were understood as forms of governance. These were not minor skills. In a world where a woman's formal power was negligible, she could not sit in parliament, could not vote until 1918, could not hold most public offices. The ability to command a drawing room, to make a house feel sovereign, was the power that was available. Violet exercised it with conviction. Diana grew up inside that understanding. She absorbed it the way children absorb language, or completely, unconsciously, and with consequences that would take decades to become visible. There is a private complication here, and it should be handled with care. In her later years, Diana said that her biological father was not the Duke of Rutland, but Harry Cust, a man of brilliance, political connections, and a reputation for romantic entanglements that made him one of the most talked about figures of his generation. Cust was a journalist, a conversationalist, a man of parliament and of bedrooms, an intimate of Violet's circle, and by Diana's own retrospective account, the man who had actually fathered her. Whether this was the precise truth or a version of the truth shaped by decades of reflection and the particular clarity that comes with old age, the claim itself is extraordinary. It means that before Diana ever married into scandal, before the affairs and the absences and the public performances of her adult life. Her own origin already carried the gap between official narrative and private reality. The daughter of a duke may, in her own telling, have been the daughter of a brilliant and wayward outsider instead. That is not tabloid revelation. That is the founding architecture of a life built on prestige and ambiguity at once, and it is worth understanding what that ambiguity taught her. Names in this world were public instruments. They appeared in the court circular, in debrettes, on the brass plates of London clubs, and the stone lintels of country houses. What happened behind those names? Who loved whom? Who fathered whom? Who drank too much or wept in private or maintained an arrangement that the servants understood and the neighbors pretended not to? Was managed by a code of silence so thorough that it functioned as a second language. Diana learned both languages before she was old enough to know she was learning them. She learned the public one at Belvoir, in the receiving rooms and the dining halls and the weekend parties where the powerful gathered. She learned the private one in the spaces between, in her mother's studio, in the corridors where whispers traveled faster than invitations, in the slowly dawning recognition that the man who raised her and the man who made her might not be the same person. That recognition did not destroy her. It equipped her. The woman who would later dazzle Embassy Paris survived the death of nearly every young man she had loved before she was 30, and turned widowhood into a literary performance, was formed in a household where the official version and the real version had never been the same thing. She did not rebel against that silence. She mastered it. And the mastery would cost her, though not yet. Diana Olivia Winifred Maud Manors was the youngest daughter of the Rutland household, and from the beginning she was the one who drew the eye. Photographs from before the First World War, the Hoppe portraits that would later become iconic, show a face that is arresting without being conventional. Large eyes set wide, a quality of stillness that reads as both composure and intensity, a jawline that photographs differently depending on the light, as though the face itself were performing. This was not the placid prettiness of the Edwardian ideal. It was something more unsettling, more modern, and it made Diana, before she had done anything at all, a public figure. She grew up knowing she was looked at. She grew up knowing that being looked at in her world was a form of power. And she grew up surrounded by a generation of young men who were brilliant, charming, privileged, and about to be destroyed. They called themselves the Coterie, or were called that by others, but a circle of aristocratic and upper-class young people bound together by wit, appetite, a taste for risk, and a collective certainty that the world was theirs to play in. Julian Grenfell, Raymond Asquith, Patrick Shaw Stewart, Edward Horner, Charles Lister, the names read now like a casualty list because that is what they became. But before 1914, they were alive, they were incandescent. They drank and argued and fell in love and danced in the great houses of England with a recklessness that was partly youthful and partly, though they could not have known it, the recklessness of people running out of time. These were not idle heirs. Raymond Asquith was the son of the Prime Minister and considered by many the most brilliant young man of his generation. Julian Grenfell was a poet. Patrick Shaw Stewart was a scholar of ferocious ability, who had taken a double first at Oxford and gone to work in this city with the carelessness of a man who knew he could do anything. They were collectively what the system was supposed to produce: young men of talent, confidence, and connection who would inherit the country and run it as their fathers had. Diana was at the center of it, the beauty around whom the circle turned. She was not passive in this. She was electric. She was the one the young men wrote to, the one the hostesses wanted at their tables, the one whose presence in a room changed its temperature. She had the gift, rare even among the charming, of making the person she was speaking to feel that nothing else in the room existed, and the war that was coming would kill them, one after another, with a thoroughness that makes their pre-war gaiety unbearable in retrospect. Julian Grenfell was killed in 1915. Raymond Asquith in 1916, Edward Horner in 1917, Patrick Shaw Stewart in 1917, Charles Lister in 1915. The toll was not unusual for the officer class. The casualty rates among public school and university men in the first years of the war were catastrophic. But for Diana, it was not a statistic. It was the systematic removal of nearly every man she had loved, admired, or danced with in the years when the world still seemed permanent. Every ball, every weekend, every love letter written from one country house to another now carries the weight of that annihilation. Diana's adult life, the marriages, the performances, the determined glitter, cannot be understood without understanding that she had watched her world be killed before she was 25. that devastation was still ahead, but it would define everything. And then there was the man who wanted to be nearest. Alfred Duff Cooper was born in 1890, 2 years before Diana, into circumstances that were comfortable but not grand. His father was a physician. His family had connections, education, the right schools, the right manners, but not the kind of wealth or title that would have made a match with a duke's daughter seem natural. Duff had attended Eton and New College, Oxford. He moved through the same world as Diana, but he moved through it with the awareness of a man who knew he was not quite of it, not by birth, not by fortune, not by the effortless assumption that life would arrange itself around his convenience. That awareness gave him an edge the Coterie men lacked. They were born into their confidence. Duff had to earn his, and earning it made him sharper, more driven, and more dangerous. He was also from the beginning a man of appetites. This is not a euphemism. Duff Cooper loved women, wine, gambling, conversation, and political combat with an intensity that was both his gift and his liability. He could be charming in 3 languages. He could hold a dinner table the way a conductor holds an orchestra, not by dominating it, but by making everyone else play better. He could write, and later did, producing books and diaries that survive as some of the most vivid records of 20th century English political life. His biography of Talleyrand, published in 1932, was not the work of an amateur dabbling in history. It was the work of a man who understood power from the inside and could render it in prose that was elegant, ruthless, and live. He was, in short, the kind of man who could resign from the cabinet over a principle, and he would over Munich in 1938, and also the kind who could wound the woman he loved through serial infidelity so persistent that it became, over decades, less a betrayal than a condition of the marriage. Diana knew this about him. She knew it before she married him, and she married him anyway. That choice is one of the central facts of the story, and it resists easy explanation. It was not naivety. Diana was many things, but she was never naive about men. It was not resignation. It was something closer to a calculated bet, a bet that the intensity, the brilliance, the shared understanding of how the world worked, the sheer force of the man, would be worth the price. Whether it was worth the price is a question the documentary cannot answer. Diana herself never answered it cleanly. What can be said is that the marriage endured, and that its endurance was not passive. It was work. It was performance. It was at times a kind of warfare conducted in drawing rooms, and Diana fought it with weapons that were entirely her own. Beauty, social command, the ability to make a room belong to her, and a refusal to let the private wounds become a public narrative. The code of silence she had learned at Belvoir. The code that said a duchess does not explain, does not complain, does not give the world the satisfaction of seeing her bleed, thus served her well. It also imprisoned her. That, too, is a later chapter. There is one more figure who must be introduced here, even though he arrives late in the timeline and his full weight will not be felt until the final acts of this story. John Julius Cooper was born in September 1929, the only child of Duff and Diana. He came into the world inside a household that was already famous, already watched, already performing. His childhood would be shaped by spectacle and displacement. A mother whose beauty was public property, a father whose absences, political, romantic, alcoholic, were a private fact, and then the war, which sent him, like so many children of his class, across the Atlantic for safety. He would grow up to become a writer, a broadcaster, a historian of Venice and Byzantium, and eventually one of the chief custodians of the family archive, editing Duff's diaries and publishing Diana's letters with the care of a man who understood that the family's survival now depended not on land or title, but on the written word. That is not a footnote. That is the next stage of adaptation, and it belongs in this story because it shows that even the definition of inheritance changed. By the time John Julius was doing his life's work, what the Coopers passed on was not an estate. It was a version of the past, curated, published, and defended against time. But that came decades later. In the beginning, there were simply 3 people: a beautiful woman, an ambitious man, and a child born into the spectacle of their partnership, trying to build a life inside a system that still looked from the outside as though it would hold. The marriage itself, in June 1919, was a social event of the first order and a private defiance of the second. Violet, Duchess of Rutland, had not wanted Duff Cooper for her daughter. He was not rich enough. He was not titled enough. His appetites were already known, his prospects promising but not guaranteed. Violet wanted something grander, something safer, something more in keeping with the name her daughter carried and the world that name was supposed to inhabit. Diana chose Duff anyway. That choice, love over suitability, intensity over security, a man of brilliance and risk over the safe Duke's son her mother preferred, set the terms for everything that followed. It was an act of independence that also happened to be an act of enormous social confidence, because Diana understood, even at 27, that her own fame was large enough to carry a husband who did not yet have a title of his own. She was not marrying up. She was not marrying down. She was marrying sideways, into a different kind of power, political, intellectual, modern, and she was betting that the combination would be more potent than anything the old arrangement could offer. If this story has you as captivated as I think it has, do subscribe. What happened next to this family is something the public never knew, and we're only just beginning. The early years proved the bet was thrilling, and the odds were uncertain. Duff's parliamentary salary was modest. The couple's social life was expensive. London was not cheap, and the style in which they were expected to live, dinner parties, clothes, entertaining, maintaining their place in the social machinery that connected Mayfair to Westminster, to the country houses where policy was still discussed over port, far exceeded what a backbencher's income could support. The gap between what the Coopers represented and what the Coopers could afford was one of the defining tensions of the marriage's early years, and it would have been recognizable to anyone in their circle. Plenty of political couples lived on the edge of what they could sustain. What made the Coopers different was Diana's solution. She went on the stage. She took the lead role in Max Reinhardt's theatrical spectacle, The Miracle, a lavish production that opened in New York in 1924 and subsequently toured Europe and America, drawing enormous audiences and extraordinary notices. The production itself was astonishing. Reinhardt transformed entire theaters into cathedrals. Thousands of performers filled the space, and Diana, playing the role of a nun tempted by the world, stood at the center of it in a silence that audiences found mesmerizing, the daughter of a duke, performing before the paying public. In the world she came from, this was not quite respectable. Acting was for other people, for professionals, for the middle classes, for women without names that appeared in Burke's peerage. Diana did it anyway, and she did it well. And she did it because the money mattered. The income from the miracle was substantial. It helped fund Duff's political career, helped him leave the Foreign Office and stand for Parliament, helped the couple build a life that would later look from the outside like effortless grandeur. The glamour was not decorative, it was structural. It paid the bills that allowed a brilliant man without a fortune to pursue the political career that would take him to the cabinet table and eventually to the British embassy in Paris. That is worth pausing on. The public saw Diana Cooper, society beauty, amateur actress, ornament of the interwar world. The mechanism underneath was something harder and more interesting. A woman converting personal fame into household income, using performance to fund politics, turning the fact of being looked at into a career that sustained the partnership. Nothing about this was accidental. Nothing about this was frivolous. And nothing about this would last forever. The miracle tours would end. The income would cease. The financial precariousness would return in different forms. But the pattern was established. Diana's public visibility was not separate from the Coopers' private survival. It was the engine of it. By the mid-1930s, the couple had built themselves into a two-person institution. Diana's beauty and theatricality, Duff's political ambition and intellectual force, their shared ease with writers and royals and diplomats. Together, they occupied a position in English life that was part political, part social, part cultural, and entirely dependent on a world that was about to be remade by forces that did not care about dinner parties. Duff had risen. He was in the cabinet. He was Secretary of State for War, then First Lord of the Admiralty, the office that Churchill himself had once held. The house was full of the right people. The weekends were brilliant. The dinners were famous. John Julius, still a small boy, was growing up inside a world of spectacle and intensity, of parents who were always performing in a household that never quite settled into domesticity because domesticity was not what either of them had been built for. And it was in the summer of 1936, aboard a yacht in the Adriatic, that the performance reached its most dangerous and most revealing peak. King Edward VIII had chartered the yacht Naline for a cruise down the Dalmatian coast, and the Coopers were among the invited guests. The party was intimate, glamorous, and shadowed by the presence of Wallis Simpson, the American divorcee whose relationship with the king was already an open secret among the people who mattered, and a close one to the British public. Wallis was not aristocratic, not English, not the sort of woman a British king was supposed to love. She was sharp, polished, and had the particular confidence of someone who had learned social power rather than inherited it, a quality that Diana, who had inherited hers and then had to learn a different kind on the stage, would have recognized even if she did not admire it. The king was besotted. The establishment was alarmed, and on the Naline, floating through the warm waters of the Adriatic in the last full summer before the crisis broke, the people closest to the throne watched and said nothing. Diana knew, Duff knew, everyone on board knew. They drank together, sunbathed together, dined together, watched the coastline slide past in the golden light of an Adriatic summer, and nobody said the thing that everyone was thinking because saying it would have meant admitting that the system they all depended on, the system of discretion, of managed silence, of private arrangements maintained behind public facades, had failed at the very top. The code that governed Belvoir, that governed every great house and every political marriage and every affair conducted within the boundaries of acceptable secrecy, was about to be broken by the King Emperor himself. And the Coopers were close enough to feel the tremor. It is worth noting here that Diana's world was also by this time a world observed by some of the sharpest literary minds of the century. Evelyn Waugh, who had entered her orbit and would remain in it for decades, corresponded with her in letters that survive in extraordinary quantity. He would later immortalize her as Mrs. Stitch, a character of devastating social command, who reappears across his novels, a woman who could fix anything, arrange anything, charm anything into submission. Waugh saw Diana clearly, which is to say he saw both the magnificence and the mechanism. He understood that her social power was real and that it was also in some fundamental sense a performance that could not outlast the world that made it legible. He wrote it down. That matters because it means Diana's story would survive not only in her own memoirs, but in the fiction of one of the century's greatest novelists. And she was not merely seen, she was written into the culture. The Nullen Cruise is the perfect image for the end of this first act: gold light on the water, laughter on the deck, royalty and gossip and wine, and the easy intimacy of people who believed that access to power was the same thing as possessing it. And underneath, the first visible crack in the idea that the ruling class could still control the story told about itself. The abdication crisis would break into the open within months. The war that would reshape everything was 3 years away. The world that had produced Belvoir, the Coterie, the season, the marriages of convenience, and the affairs of inconvenience, that world was entering its terminal phase, and the people on the yacht were among the last to understand it. Diana was 44 years old. Duff was 46. John Julius was 7. The castle still stood. The name still glittered. The beauty was still famous. The husband was still brilliant. And the summer light was still falling on the deck of a royal yacht in waters that would soon enough be a theater of war. This is as good as it is going to look. Everything Diana and Duff have built, the partnership, the reputation, the careful architecture of glamour and ambition and performance, is about to be tested by forces that do not care about charm. What comes next is evacuation, bombing, rationing, the administrative state, and a world in which glitter will have to justify itself or die. The golden age is over. The Coopers do not know it yet, but they are about to find out. Within months of the Nollins' return to port, the crisis that everyone on board had politely ignored became the constitutional emergency that nobody could. Edward VIII's determination to marry Wallis Simpson placed the monarchy, the government, and the entire machinery of the British establishment under a strain it had not experienced since the Parliament Act a generation earlier. For Diana and Duff, the abdication was not an event observed from a distance. They knew these people. They had eaten with them, cruised with them, sat at tables where the future of the crown was discussed in the same register as the wine list. Duff, as a member of the political class and a personal friend of the king, was drawn into the maneuverings, the conversations in clubs and drawing rooms, where possible outcomes were weighed, alliances were tested, and the unthinkable was gradually acknowledged as the inevitable. Diana, as a woman whose social position placed her at the intersection of the court, the cabinet, and the aristocratic world that orbited both, watched the man she had liked and the system she had been raised inside reach a point of mutual incompatibility that no amount of discretion could resolve. The abdication, when it came in December 1936, was swift and devastating. Edward renounced the throne. His brother became George VI. Wallis Simpson became the Duchess of Windsor, exiled from the court that had once revolved around her lover. And the British establishment, shaken but intact, closed ranks and carried on. For the public, the abdication was a drama with a clear resolution. For the people inside the world the Coopers inhabited, it was something more unsettling. It was a demonstration that the code of silence, the code that had governed private life in Diana's world since before she was born, had limits. When the private arrangement became too large to conceal, when the silence could no longer hold, the system did not bend, it expelled. The King Emperor himself was not immune. That lesson landed differently on Diana and Duff. For Duff, the political implications were immediate. The new king, George VI, represented a return to convention, a restoration of the understanding that the crown existed to serve the state rather than the desires of the man who wore it, and the political landscape shifted accordingly. For Diana, the lesson was subtler and more personal. She had spent her entire life inside a world that managed its contradictions through discretion. Her own parentage, her husband's infidelities, the financial precariousness beneath the social surface, all of it had been held in place by the agreement that certain things were not said aloud. The abdication proved that the agreement could be broken, and that when it broke, the consequences were swift, public, and irreversible. She filed that knowledge away. It would serve her for decades. But the abdication, for all its drama, was a rehearsal. The crisis it represented, the collision between private desire and public duty, the failure of silence to contain reality, and was dramatic but contained. The crown survived. The system adapted. The real fracture, the one that would change the Cooper's trajectory permanently, was political rather than royal, and it came in the autumn of 1938. Duff Cooper had risen through the cabinet with a speed that reflected both his ability and his willingness to do the hard work of governance that many men of his social position found beneath them. He was not a dilettante politician. He was a working one. He read his briefs. He mastered his departments. He understood the machinery of the state in a way that made him valuable to prime ministers, even when they found him personally difficult. He had served as financial secretary to the Treasury, then as Secretary of State for War, and by 1937 he held one of the great offices of state, First Lord of the Admiralty. It was the post that Churchill had held during the Great War, the post from which the Royal Navy was directed, and it placed Duff at the center of British strategic decision-making at the precise moment when strategic decisions mattered more than they had in a generation. Adolf Hitler's Germany was rearming, expanding, annexing, and testing the willingness of the European democracies to resist. And the British government, under Neville Chamberlain, had decided that the willingness to resist was a luxury the country could not afford. There is something about Duff Cooper's position in the autumn of 1938 that the documentary must render with care, because it is one of the moments where private character and public consequence become inseparable. Duff was not a pacifist. He was not a sentimentalist about war. He had fought in the trenches himself during the Great War, had served with the Grenadier Guards, had been wounded, had watched men die in the mud of France and Flanders, and had come home with a distinguished service order and a knowledge of what modern warfare actually looked like that most of his fellow politicians lacked. But he was also not a man who could watch a democracy capitulate to a dictator and pretend that the capitulation was peace. When Chamberlain returned from Munich on the 30th of September 1938, waving the agreement that conceded the Sudetenland to Hitler and declaring that he had secured peace for our time, Duff resigned from the cabinet. He was the only member to do so. His resignation speech in the House of Commons was measured, precise, and devastating. He did not shout. He did not posture. He simply laid out, in the controlled prose of a man who had thought carefully about what he was doing, the case that Munich was not peace, but surrender, and that surrender would not prevent war, but guarantee it on the worst terms. That resignation was an act of principle, and it cost him. He lost his office, his salary, his place at the table where decisions were made. He lost the Admiralty residence, which had been one of the great perquisites of the post, a house in Whitehall, maintained by the state, staffed, heated, and grand enough to receive anyone in the kingdom. The Coopers had to find somewhere else to live. They had to recalculate, once again, the relationship between their public visibility and their private means. For a man whose identity was built on political relevance, on being in the room at the dinner, in the conversation that mattered, the loss was not merely professional, it was existential. Duff Cooper without a cabinet post was still brilliant, still well-connected, still married to the most famous woman in England. But he was, for the first time in years, standing outside the structure that had given his brilliance its purpose. Diana felt the consequences differently. The resignation was noble. She understood that. She admired it. She had, by all accounts, supported it. But she also understood what it meant in practical terms: less money, less position, less of the insulation that official life provided against the chronic anxiety of being famous and not quite solvent. The Coopers were not rich. They had never been rich in the way that the families they moved among were rich. They did not have Chatsworth's endowment or Blenheim's estate income, or the kind of inherited capital that absorbed shocks without showing bruises. They had Diana's fame, Duff's career, and the social capital that accrued to both. And now one of those pillars had been voluntarily removed. Diana was the wife of men who had done the right thing and was paying for it in the currency that mattered most in their world: relevance. The combination of moral clarity and material cost would define the next phase of their lives. It would also, in retrospect, prove to be the making of them. But they could not know that yet. All they knew in the autumn of 1938 was that the great game had ejected one of its most talented players, and that the player's wife was once again left holding the domestic reality while the political world moved on without them. And then the war came, and the question of whether Duff had been right ceased to be a question at all. On the 3rd of September 1939, Britain declared war on Germany, and the world that the Nalin cruise had seemed to promise, a world of golden afternoons and managed crises and elite discretion, was replaced by something that did not care about any of those things. The war did not arrive as a single event for Diana. It arrived as a series of losses, dislocations, and adaptations that stripped away, layer by layer, the apparatus of the life she had known. The London houses were blacked out. The country weekends ceased. Friends who had been dinner companions became officers, administrators, casualties. The whole elaborate social infrastructure that had sustained Diana's world, the hostesses, the invitations, the network of houses and clubs and restaurants where influence was traded, contracted overnight into something smaller, harder, and more honest. The first and oldest wound was already decades deep. The Coterie, the men she had danced with before 1914, the men who had written her love letters from country houses that still existed but would never again contain the same laughter. Those men were already dead. Julian Grenfell, Raymond Asquith, Patrick Shaw Stewart, Edward Horner, Charles Lister. Diana had carried that loss for more than 20 years by the time the Second War began, and the carrying had shaped her in ways that were not always visible on the surface. The determined gaiety that outsiders sometimes mistook for frivolity was in part a response to bereavement so total that it had become a permanent condition. She had learned before she was 25 that the people you loved could be taken from you with industrial efficiency, and that the world would go on hosting dinners and arranging flowers as though they had never existed. The Second World War did not teach her that lesson. It confirmed it. And the confirmation made her harder and more tender and more determined to survive, all at the same time. What the war did teach her was something about the limits of her own world's usefulness. Diana was not a woman who could be mobilized in the conventional sense. She was not young, and she was 47 when the war began. She was not trained in anything the state needed. She was not in any bureaucratic category a useful asset. She was the wife of a politically exiled former cabinet minister, the daughter of a duke, and the most photographed woman of her generation, and none of those things could stop a bomb or feed a battalion. What she could do, what she did, was adapt. And the adaptation was more radical than anything the public image suggested. She took up farming at Bognor, on the Sussex coast, working the land with a determination that astonished people who had only ever seen her in evening dress or on the cover of a society magazine. She kept cows. She grew vegetables. She learned the particular exhaustion of physical labor that has no audience, no applause, no photographer waiting at the gate. The woman who had commanded ballrooms was now commanding a dairy, and the shift was not merely practical, it was existential. For the first time in her adult life, Diana's daily work had nothing to do with being seen. The performance that had sustained her since the miracle, the performance that had funded Duff's career and maintained the couple's social position, was suddenly irrelevant. Nobody needed her to be beautiful. Nobody needed her to hold a room. What was needed was food, and Diana, with the adaptability that was perhaps her deepest gift, provided it. She also served in wartime auxiliary roles, contributed to morale efforts, and maintained the social connections that even in wartime functioned as a kind of informal intelligence network. The aristocratic world did not cease to exist during the Blitz. It contracted, went underground, gathered in smaller rooms, and continued the conversations that had always been its business. conversations about who knew whom, who was posted where, who was reliable and who was not. Diana moved through this diminished world with the ease of a woman who had been navigating it since birth, but she moved through it now with a weariness that the pre-war Diana would not have recognized. She was tired, she was frightened, and she was writing letters, hundreds of them, thousands over the course of the war, to friends, to Duff, and above all to her son, who was no longer in England. John Julius's evacuation is one of those details that seems at first like a minor logistical fact and reveals itself on closer examination as one of the emotional centers of the story. He was 10 years old when the war began, 11 when the decision was made to send him away. He was the only child of two famous parents, raised in a household where performance was constant and domesticity was intermittent, a boy who had grown up watching his mother dazzle rooms and his father leave for meetings that were more interesting than bedtime. And now the household itself was dissolving under the pressure of global conflict. In 1940, as the Blitz began and the threat of invasion seemed real, John Julius was sent across the Atlantic to North America, to safety, to strangers, away from the bombs and the rationing, and most devastatingly, away from his mother. The decision was rational. Thousands of families made the same one. The Children's Overseas Reception Board had been established specifically to evacuate children from the areas most at risk, and the privileged classes had their own networks, relatives, friends, connections in Canada and the United States who could take a child and provide the kind of upbringing that the bombs made impossible at home. It was sensible. It was responsible. It was also an admission, one that cut to the heart of everything Diana's world believed about itself, that the old guarantees had failed. The houses that were supposed to be permanent could be bombed. The country that was supposed to be inviolable could be invaded. The class that was supposed to govern could not even keep its own children safe. The boy who was meant to inherit continuity instead inherited dislocation. Diana's letters to John Julius during this period survive in the Churchill archives at Cambridge, and they are among the most revealing documents in the entire family record. They are not grand. They are not performative. They are written in the voice of a mother who is frightened and is trying not to show it, who is maintaining the surface. The wit, the lightness, the refusal to dramatize, while underneath the ground is giving way. She told him about the garden. She told him about the cows at Bognor. She told him about the small domestic victories that had replaced the grand social ones, a successful crop, a repaired fence, a meal assembled from rations and ingenuity, and the kind of resourcefulness that duchesses were not supposed to need. She described the countryside. She described the weather. She described, in the careful, bright language of a woman determined to make absence bearable, a world that was still functioning, still recognizable, still safe enough to come home to when the time came. She did not tell him, or did not tell him plainly, about the fear, about the nights when the bombs fell close enough to feel, about the mornings when the news from Europe made the prospect of victory seem distant and the prospect of reunion impossible. The fear was there anyway, legible between the lines to anyone who has ever written a letter to a child they could not protect. Diana addressed him as Darling Monster. The name was a private endearment that would later become the title of the published collection. It is a name that contains everything: the tenderness, the performance, the instinct to make even love sound like a joke, because jokes were safer than admitting how much it hurt. Duff, meanwhile, was being drawn back into the machinery he had left. Churchill, who had replaced Chamberlain as Prime Minister in May 1940 at the moment of Britain's greatest peril, understood the value of men who had been right when the establishment had been wrong. Duff had been right about Munich. He had paid for being right. And now Churchill, assembling a war government from the wreckage of appeasement, brought him back. The return was not to the Admiralty, that post went to others, but to a series of roles that used Duff's particular combination of diplomatic skill, literary intelligence, and knowledge of Europe. He was appointed Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster and then Minister of Information, a post that suited his talents for persuasion and his understanding of how public narratives were constructed and, when necessary, managed. The Ministry of Information was not a glamorous posting. It was a bureaucratic engine for propaganda, censorship, and the delicate business of keeping a besieged democracy both informed and resolute. Duff ran it with the same combination of force and charm that he brought to everything, though the constraints of wartime administration did not sit naturally on a man who had spent his career in the more elegant chambers of political life. He was later sent to the Far East on an inspection and liaison mission: Singapore, Malaya, the colonial territories that were about to be swept away by Japanese advance. and the experience marked him. He saw, at closer range than most British politicians of his generation, the fragility of the imperial structure that his class had always assumed was permanent. The British Empire was not just a map colored pink. It was a system maintained by habit, by bluff, by the willingness of distant populations to accept the authority of people who looked and sounded like Duff Cooper. That willingness was eroding, and the war accelerated the erosion. Duff returned from the Far East a man who understood, perhaps more clearly than before, that the world he had been trained to govern was not going to survive the war in the form he had known it. Diana at Bognor understood the same thing through a different lens. The servants were gone, not all of them, but enough to make the machinery of household life, which had always been maintained by invisible labor, suddenly visible and effortful. The great houses she had visited as a girl, the houses where weekends had been staged with the precision of theatrical productions, were being requisitioned for military use, shuttered for the duration, or slowly deteriorating under the weight of maintenance deferred and taxation anticipated. The social calendar that had structured aristocratic life for generations, the season, the presentations at court, the rituals of precedence and display, had been suspended, and though nobody said so explicitly, there was a growing sense that the suspension might be permanent. The world was being rebuilt by planners, civil servants, technocrats, and democratic mandate, and the old assumption that people like the Coopers would naturally be at the center of that rebuilding was no longer safe. It was not even any longer widely shared. By 1943, the shape of the postwar world was becoming visible, and it was not a shape that favored the old order. The Beveridge Report had been published in December 1942, and its vision of comprehensive social insurance, a welfare state that would protect citizens from cradle to grave, funded by taxation, administered by government, replacing the ad hoc charities and noblesse oblige of the old system, with something systematic and universal, had captured the public imagination with a force that alarmed the conservative establishment. The political mood was shifting leftward with a velocity that the people inside the great houses could feel but could not stop. The Labour Party, which would win the general election of July 1945 in a landslide that stunned even Churchill, was already articulating a vision of Britain in which the great houses and the titled families and the networks of privilege that had governed the country for centuries would be, if not abolished, then fundamentally marginalized. Death duties would rise. They had been rising for decades, and the post-war rates would reach levels that made the maintenance of large estates mathematically untenable. Income tax would bite. The country houses that had survived the war physically would face a post-war settlement designed not to destroy them, but through the quiet mechanics of fiscal policy to make them economically impossible to sustain. The world Diana had been born into, the world of Belvoir, of the season, of servants and staircases, and the assumption that rank was a permanent fact, was not being attacked by revolutionaries. It was being outgrown by a democracy that no longer needed or wanted what the aristocracy had to offer. That process had been underway since before Diana was born. The war accelerated it to the point of no return, and it was in this context, the context of a class being slowly, methodically, and democratically replaced by a system it had not built and could not control, that something extraordinary happened. Churchill, who understood the symbolic as well as the strategic dimensions of the war, who grasped instinctively that diplomacy was as much about atmosphere as it was about memoranda, needed an ambassador in Paris. He needed someone who could represent Britain to a liberated France, who could navigate the extraordinarily complex politics of de Gaulle's provisional government, who could manage the egos and sensitivities of a nation that had been occupied for 4 years and was not going to be grateful to its liberators without also being resentful of them. He needed someone who could make the British embassy feel like a center of civilization at a moment when civilization itself was in question. He chose Duff Cooper, and with Duff came Diana. The appointment was made in late 1943, though the Coopers would not arrive in Paris until the liberation made it possible. Duff went first to Algiers, where the French provisional government was based, and began the diplomatic work that would precede the embassy posting. Diana followed. The couple were reunited in North Africa, in a landscape that bore no resemblance to the drawing rooms and country houses of their previous life. Dust, heat, military camps, the improvised grandeur of a government in exile. And they began to prepare for a role that would become the most famous and most bittersweet chapter of their partnership. On the 13th of September 1944, Duff Cooper arrived in Paris. The city had been liberated less than 3 weeks earlier. The streets still bore the marks of occupation and combat. Bullet holes in the facades of buildings along the grand boulevards, the absence of traffic that occupation had made normal and liberation had not yet reversed. The strange, volatile atmosphere of a city that was free but not yet sure what freedom would look like. The Hôtel de Charros, the 18th century mansion on the Rue du Faubourg Saint-Honoré, that had served as the British embassy since the Duke of Wellington purchased it in 1814, had survived the war with its fabric largely intact, but its purpose suspended for 4 years. The Germans had occupied Paris. The embassy had been shuttered. The silverware, the paintings, the accumulated diplomatic furniture of a century and a half of Anglo-French relations had been stored, hidden, dispersed. Now it was being reassembled, and Duff arrived, by some accounts, in a Dakota aircraft with a Spitfire escort, a detail that, whether precisely documented or embellished in the retelling, captures something essential about the moment. This was not merely a diplomatic appointment, it was a restoration, or at least it was designed to look like one. Britain was re-entering Paris. The embassy was reopening. And the couple chosen to represent Britain in France's most important diplomatic residence were a former First Lord of the Admiralty who had resigned over Munich, a decision that now looked not just principled, but prophetic, and a duke's daughter who had spent the war years farming at Bognor and writing letters to a child across an ocean and keeping cows alive while her world collapsed. That they were chosen at all tells you something about Churchill's instinct for the symbolic. He understood that the reopening of the embassy was not merely an administrative act, it was a performance. And he chose the two people in England best equipped to give that performance its full weight. Diana arrived to find the embassy in a state of grandeur and desolation that might have been designed as a metaphor for her own life. The rooms were beautiful. The proportions, the moldings, the sense of a house that had been built to impress and had spent 130 years succeeding. The furniture survived, much of it. The gardens were still there. But the house needed to be brought back to life, to be staffed, heated, lit, filled with people and conversation and the particular kind of energy that turns a building into an institution. And bringing a house back to life was something Diana had been trained to do since childhood. She understood in her bones what it meant to make a room feel inhabited, purposeful, sovereign. She understood that hospitality, in the right context, was not social trivia, but an instrument of statecraft. That the dinner you gave, the guests you seated next to each other, the wine you poured, and the conversation you steered could accomplish things the memoranda and treaties could not. She understood, this is the crucial point, and that the skills her mother Violet had cultivated at Belvoir, the skills of atmosphere and performance and the management of human attention, were about to become, for one last extraordinary period, genuinely useful. The viewer should feel, at this moment, the force of the reversal. For 6 years, Diana's world had been contracting. The houses were closed, the friends were scattered or dead. The child was sent away, the husband's career had been interrupted, resumed in diminished form, and redirected to the chaos of wartime administration. The beauty that had once been currency was aging. Diana was 52 years old. The social power that had once been effortless now required effort, strategy, and the particular kind of energy that only comes from a person who refuses to accept that the game is over. And then, suddenly, in the autumn of 1944, in a liberated city still electric with the memory of occupation and the uncertainty of reconstruction, Diana Cooper was placed at the center of one of Europe's great rooms and told, in effect, to make it work. She did. That much is not in dispute. What is in dispute? What the next chapter of this story will explore is whether making it work was a restoration or a last performance, whether the embassy years were a genuine return to the old power or the most glamorous final act in British social history, whether Diana, presiding over Anglo-French diplomatic life in a continent rebuilding itself from rubble, was once again what she had always been, the woman who made the room feel sovereign, or whether she was something more fragile and more heroic, a survivor staging a version of a world that had already ceased to exist, holding the illusion together by sheer force of will and the accumulated habits of a lifetime spent making rooms work. That question would take a decade to answer. And the answer, when it came, would arrive not in an embassy ballroom or a country house drawing room, but on the deck of a ship in the North Atlantic, on a winter night at the turn of the year, in the silence between one world and the next. The British Embassy in Paris, in the autumn of 1944, was not simply a diplomatic posting. It was a stage. And Diana Cooper, who had spent her entire adult life preparing for exactly this kind of performance, stepped onto it with a conviction that astonished even the people who thought they knew her. The Hôtel de Charost was one of the finest houses in Paris, 18th century proportions, a garden that ran back from the Rue du Faubourg Saint-Honoré, with the quiet confidence of a property that had been important for 2 centuries and rooms that had hosted every significant figure in Anglo-French relations since Wellington. It had survived the occupation physically intact but spiritually depleted, a beautiful shell waiting to be filled. Diana filled it. She filled it the way her mother Violet had filled Belvoir. Not merely with furniture and flowers, though there were plenty of both, but with atmosphere, with the particular quality of attention that made every guest feel that they had entered a room that mattered. She understood instinctively and from long practice that an embassy was not an office, it was a house, and a house in Diana's world was an instrument. You used it the way a musician used an instrument, to create something that could not exist without it, something that was more than the sum of its physical parts. The dinners she gave at the Hôtel de Charos became famous not because the food was extraordinary, though it was good, or because the wine was exceptional, though Duff made sure it was, but because the room felt alive in a way that other diplomatic rooms did not. Writers sat next to generals, politicians sat next to painters. The conversation moved across languages, French, English, occasionally something else, with a fluency that was not accidental. Diana arranged it. She placed people next to each other for reasons that were social, political, and sometimes mischievous, and the results were evenings that accomplished, in the space between the soup and the cheese, things that formal negotiations had failed to achieve. This was not frivolity. It needs to be said plainly, because the temptation to dismiss Diana's embassy years as merely decorative is the temptation that has followed her reputation for a century. What she did in Paris was work. It was skilled, deliberate, and consequential. The relationship between Britain and France in the immediate post-war period was extraordinarily delicate. De Gaulle's France was proud, wounded, resentful of its dependence on Anglo-American liberation, and determined to reassert itself as a great power at a moment when its claim to greatness was fragile. The provisional government was navigating the aftermath of occupation. The collaborators, the resistors, the millions of people who had done neither but had simply endured, and who were now expected to rebuild a country from rubble and recrimination. Britain, exhausted by the war, diminished by the cost of victory, losing its empire in slow motion from India to Palestine, and struggling with the onset of austerity at home, needed France as an ally but could not afford to patronize it. The diplomatic space between those two needs, French pride and British pragmatism, was narrow, treacherous, and easily destabilized by a clumsy word or an ill-judged gesture. It required navigating with a sensitivity that went beyond policy papers and bilateral meetings. It required the kind of understanding that came from sitting in a beautiful room with the right people and letting the conversation do what conversation does when it is well managed. Build trust without requiring anyone to admit that trust was what they were building. Duff managed the formal diplomacy. He was good at it. His French was excellent, his understanding of European politics was deep, and his personal rapport with de Gaulle, while never easy, was built on the mutual respect of two men who had both, in their different ways, defied their own establishments. But Duff's diplomacy operated in offices and meeting rooms. Diana's operated in the spaces around them, in the drawing rooms, the dining rooms, the garden parties, the small suppers, where the real feelings emerged because the setting permitted them to. The embassy under the Coopers became a place where the formal and the informal were so thoroughly intertwined that it was impossible to say where the hospitality ended and the statecraft began. That was the point. That had always been the point of places like this. Diana simply understood it better than almost anyone alive. The guest lists from this period, preserved in the archives, read like a directory of mid-century European cultural and political life. André Malraux, Jean Cocteau, Louise de Vilmorin, with whom Duff would later conduct an affair so visible that it became one of the embassy's open secrets. Gaston Pawlowski, de Gaulle's chef de cabinet, who was himself romantically entangled with Nancy Mitford, another connection that blurred the boundaries between the diplomatic and the personal in ways that the Coopers' world had always found natural. The literary figures were as prominent as the political ones. Evelyn Waugh visited. So did the writers and intellectuals who populated post-war Paris with an intensity that made the city feel, once again, like the cultural capital of Europe. Diana moved among all of them with a grace that was partly natural, partly cultivated, and partly the result of decades of practice. She was 60 years of the Coterie and Belvoir and the Miracle and 100 country house weekends and 1,000 dinner parties, all distilled into a woman who knew exactly how to make a room work. But there is something the documentary must hold in tension here, because it is the central paradox of the embassy years. The brilliance was real. The influence was real. The hospitality accomplished things that memos could not. And yet the world that made this kind of power legible, the world in which a well-placed dinner could shape policy, in which social access was a form of political capital, in which the wife of an ambassador could exercise genuine influence through the management of atmosphere, that world was dying. Not in Paris. In Paris, it still functioned, because Paris had always valued what Diana offered: elegance, culture, the art of living well as a political statement. But in Britain, the ground was shifting under the Coopers' feet, even as they performed their finest hour. The Labour government that had won the 1945 election was remaking the country along lines that had no place for embassy glamour. The National Health Service was established in 1948. Nationalization of key industries was underway. Taxation was rising to levels that made the old aristocratic life not merely difficult, but in many cases mathematically impossible. The great houses that Diana had grown up visiting, the houses where weekends had been staged and alliances forged and marriages arranged over port and pheasant, were being sold, demolished, or opened reluctantly to a paying public that arrived in motor cars and wanted to see the kitchens. The world was being rebuilt by technocrats and democratic mandate, and the old assumption that social grace was a form of governance was becoming, in Britain at least, an anachronism. Diana's embassy was a masterpiece. It was also, whether she knew it or not, a valediction. Duff knew something was ending, even if he did not name it in those terms, and his diaries from this period, published decades later by John Julius, who would spend much of his adult life serving as editor and custodian of his parents' written legacy, reveal a man who was enjoying the role, but was also aware of its limits. He was drinking heavily. He was conducting affairs. Louise de Vilmorin was the most prominent, but she was not the only one. With the serial persistence that had characterized his romantic life since before the marriage, the infidelities were not secret. They were not, in the world he inhabited, even particularly scandalous. The French understood. The British diplomatic staff understood. Diana understood. She had understood for decades. The arrangement was old, well established, and managed by the same code of silence that had governed her parents' marriage and very likely her own conception. Duff loved Diana. Diana loved Duff. Duff also loved other women. Diana endured it, absorbed it, and converted the pain into a kind of stoic performance that the people around her sometimes mistook for indifference. It was not indifference, it was discipline. And the discipline cost her, though she would never have said so publicly. The question of what Diana felt about Duff's infidelities is one that the documentary should handle with care, because the available evidence is suggestive rather than definitive. She wrote about it obliquely. She spoke about it rarely. She maintained, to the end of her life, the position that a wife of her generation and class did not make a public inventory of her husband's failings, because to do so would be to admit that the marriage had been anything other than what it appeared. The appearance mattered. The appearance was, in a sense, the marriage, the public partnership, the shared project, the two-person institution that they had built together over 30 years. To dismantle the appearance by naming the private grievances would have been to destroy the thing she had spent her life constructing. Diana chose the construction over the confession. Whether that choice was wisdom or imprisonment is a question the film cannot resolve. It can only observe that she made it, and that the making of it shaped everything that followed. By 1947, the embassy years were reaching their peak, and the peak was already the beginning of the descent. Duff's position was strong but not permanent. He had been a wartime appointment, and the post-war world was producing its own diplomats, its own rhythms, its own requirements. The Labour government had no particular affection for a conservative aristocrat running the Paris embassy as though it were a country house with a larger guest list. Duff sensed the change. He began to prepare, not for a return to British political life. That door had closed, or at least narrowed to a passage too small for a man of his appetites, but for a retirement that would keep him in France, close to the world that still valued what he offered. The retirement, when it came in 1947, was not a collapse. It was a managed withdrawal, the kind of exit that looked from the outside like a choice rather than a verdict. Duff and Diana left the embassy and moved to a house near Chantilly, North of Paris, the Château de Saint-Firmin, a property set in the grounds of the Château de Chantilly itself, surrounded by forest and parkland, and the kind of landscape that suggested permanence, even when permanence was exactly what had been lost. The house allowed them to remain in France, to remain close to the social and cultural life that had sustained them during the embassy years, and to avoid the return to an England that was no longer the country they had left. That choice should be given its full weight because it reveals something important about the Coopers' relationship to Britain. They did not go home, they stayed in France. And the staying was not temporary. It was a decision that would last the rest of Duff's life. The reasons were partly practical. France was cheaper, warmer, more congenial to a couple whose style of living had always depended on a certain ease of atmosphere that post-war Britain, with its rationing and its austerity and its mood of democratic leveling, could no longer provide. A dinner party at Chantilly could still feel like a civilized occasion. A dinner party in London in 1947 felt like an exercise in creative deprivation, the food restricted, the wine scarce, the mood cautious, the whole enterprise shadowed by the awareness that the country was broke and that conspicuous pleasure was, if not prohibited, then certainly suspect. But the reasons were also deeper than practical convenience. The Coopers stayed in France because France still understood what they were. In France, a brilliant hostess was not an anachronism. She was an asset. In France, the art of conversation and the culture of the salon and the idea that social life could be a form of civilization rather than merely a form of recreation, all of these things were still valued, still practiced, still legible as real accomplishments. In Britain, they were becoming quaint. The Coopers chose the country that still spoke their language, and the choice, though never phrased as exile, carried the unmistakable quality of one. At Chantilly, the Coopers maintained a version of the life they had always led, scaled down from embassy grandeur, but still recognizably theirs. They entertained, not with the diplomatic purpose of the embassy years, but with the social purpose that had always been Diana's native element. They received visitors, writers, diplomats, old friends from London and Paris, the remnants of the world that had once orbited them at full velocity and now visited at a gentler pace. The novelist Nancy Mitford, who had settled in Paris and whose own life was entangled with the same Anglo-French social world the Coopers inhabited, was a frequent presence. So were the remaining members of that loosely defined circle of English expatriates who found in France the civilization that England, in its post-war seriousness, no longer seemed to offer. Duff wrote. He worked on his memoirs, on books, on the diaries that would later become one of the most valuable records of 20th century British political life. He read voraciously. He drank, still always, with the persistence of a man who had never seen a reason to stop and who was now too old to find one. Diana gardened, managed the household with a competence that would have surprised anyone who knew her only from the photographs, and maintained the social connections that were, by now, less a matter of influence than of identity. They were still the Coopers. They still mattered, in the particular way that people who have once been at the center of things continue to matter even after the center has moved elsewhere. But the radius of their influence was shrinking with each passing year. The invitations were fewer. The political conversations were less urgent. The world was being run by younger people with different assumptions, different priorities, and no particular interest in consulting a retired ambassador and his famous wife about anything more consequential than a seating arrangement. John Julius, meanwhile, was growing into his own life, a life that would both continue and transform the family's legacy. He had returned from his wartime evacuation in North America to an England he barely recognized, and parents whose fame was still enormous, but whose world had changed beneath them. He completed his education at Eton, the school that had educated Duff, the school that educated the sons of the class the Coopers belonged to, the school that was itself an instrument of continuity in a world that was becoming less continuous by the year. And then went on to the University of Strasbourg, where he learned French with the fluency that his parents' world demanded, and to New College, Oxford, his father's old college. He entered the Foreign Office in 1952, a natural step for the son of an ambassador, and one that connected him for a time to the same diplomatic world his parents had inhabited. But John Julius's trajectory would diverge from his father's in ways that reflected the broader transformation of his class. The Foreign Office of the early 1950s was not the Foreign Office that Duff had entered decades earlier. It was more professional, more meritocratic, less tolerant of the amateur brilliance that had been Duff's particular style. John Julius served competently, but without the consuming ambition that had driven his father. He would leave the diplomatic service after a few years. He would become a writer. He would turn to history, not the political history of cabinets and treaties that had been his father's world, but the cultural history of Venice and Byzantium, subjects that combined scholarly rigor with a gift for narrative that was perhaps inherited from both parents. His books on Venice, on Byzantium, on the Normans in Sicily would reach wide audiences and earn genuine respect. He was, in his quiet way, converting the family's social capital into intellectual capital, transforming the networks of access and cultivation that had sustained the Coopers for decades into something more durable and more democratic. Books that anyone could read, knowledge that did not require an invitation to acquire. That conversion, from salon to library, from hospitality to scholarship, was one of the defining adaptations of his generation of the English upper class, and John Julius performed it with a grace that honored his parents even as it left their world behind. The year 1951 brought one of those moments that seem, in retrospect, like the old world staging its own farewell. In September, at the Palazzo Labia in Venice, the Mexican-born millionaire Carlos de Bestegui hosted a ball of extraordinary extravagance, a costume ball that drew the remnants of European high society in a last explosion of aristocratic theater. The event had been planned with a meticulousness that bordered on mania. Bestegui had spent years restoring the Palazzo Labia, a vast Baroque palace on the Cannaregio Canal, and the ball was both a celebration of the restoration and a statement of intent that the old European culture of spectacle, of beauty pursued for its own sake, of wealth deployed not for utility but for splendor, was not dead. 1,500 guests arrived in costumes that had been designed by some of the finest ateliers in Paris and Rome. Gondolas carried them through the canals. The palace blazed with light. And Diana, at 59 years old, appeared as Cleopatra. The costume was magnificent, elaborate, commanding, designed to announce a woman who had spent 6 decades being looked at and who was not yet finished. Diana did not attempt to look young. She did not pretend that the years had not passed. She arrived as what she was, a woman of a certain age who understood that spectacle was not about youth, but about conviction, and who had the conviction and the bone structure to carry a costume that would have crushed someone less certain of herself. The setting, Venice, a palace on the Grand Canal, chandeliers and candlelight and gondolas in the dark water of the lagoon, reflecting the glow of a party that cost more than most villages earned in a year, was everything that Diana's world had always valued: beauty as spectacle, social life as art, money and taste and daring combined into an evening that existed for no practical purpose whatsoever except to prove that it could exist. There is something about that evening that the documentary should handle as carefully as it handles Diana's parentage. It would be easy to present the Bestegui ball as mere decadence, the last gasp of a class that had nothing left to do but dress up. That would be reductive. The ball was also a statement, and a defiant, slightly desperate, magnificently realized statement that the old values of beauty and performance in social art had not yet been entirely consumed by the post-war world of austerity and social democracy and the earnest grayness that hung over Europe like a permanent overcast. Diana, dressed as Cleopatra, at 59, was not pretending that the old world still functioned. She was memorializing it. She was giving it one last evening of full theatrical expression, knowing, as she had always known, that the performance was the thing. The ball was magnificent. It was also, unmistakably, an after-image, a flash of light from a star that had already begun to cool. And then, in the New Year honors of 1952, came the Viscountcy. Duff Cooper was created Viscount Norwich of Aldwych, a title that placed him formally among the hereditary peers of the realm. On paper, it was an elevation, a recognition of decades of public service, the cabinet posts, the Munich resignation, the embassy years, the long career of political and diplomatic engagement that had made him, at various points, one of the most respected and one of the most controversial figures in British public life. In practice, the Viscountcy felt belated. The title arrived after the age that made titles most potent, after the offices had been surrendered and the embassy closed and the political world moved on. It was a decoration applied to a structure that had already served its purpose, a ribbon pinned to a uniform that was hanging in a wardrobe rather than being worn. Diana's response to the title is one of the documentary's best character details because it reveals, in a single small act, the depth of her understanding of how names worked. She refused to be called Viscountess Norwich. The name, she said, sounded like porridge. It was a joke, but it was not merely a joke. It was a rejection of a title that did not fit, that did not carry the weight or the music of the name the public already knew. Lady Diana Cooper. That was the name. That was the brand, though she would never have used such a word. That was the identity she had built over 60 years of performance, and she was not about to let a viscountcy, however well intentioned, replace it with something that sounded like a breakfast cereal. The refusal was instinctive, witty, and devastating. It was also underneath the wit, a recognition that the old system of names and titles and precedents had become, by 1952, a matter of personal curation rather than public authority. Diana kept the name that worked. She understood that a name in the world she now inhabited was not conferred by the crown. It was maintained by the person who wore it. Duff was 62. Diana was 60. John Julius was 23, newly embarked on his own career, carrying a title that he had not asked for and that connected him to a world he was already beginning to leave behind in favor of the writing life that would define him. The couple at Chantilly were still brilliant, still entertaining, still capable of making a room feel like the center of something. But the rooms were smaller now, the guests were fewer, the occasions were less frequent, and Duff's health, which had been undermined for years by the habits long embedded in his character, the drinking, the richness of the life he had led, the sheer physical cost of decades of excess conducted with elegance, was beginning to fail. They had kept the style, they had lost the structure. The embassy was someone else's now, the cabinet was someone else's. The great political dramas of the mid-century, the Cold War, the Suez Crisis that was approaching, the long renegotiation of Britain's place in the world, were being managed by people who did not need the Cooper's advice, however freely it was offered. What remained was the marriage, the house at Chantilly, the social rituals that sustained them, and the letters and diaries and memories that were already being shaped, consciously or not, into the raw material of a legacy. Diana and Duff were living in a beautifully furnished antechamber to disappearance, and the door at the far end was beginning to open. The body was the thing that could not be curated. Duff's decline was not sudden. It was the slow, familiar deterioration of a man who had lived hard and well, and who was now paying the accumulated cost. The drinking that had been a feature of his character since youth, the wine at lunch, the whiskey in the evening, the claret at dinner, the assumption shared by most men of his class and generation that alcohol was not a problem but a companion, a lubricant for conversation, a necessary accompaniment to the civilized life, had taken its toll on a constitution that was no longer young enough to absorb it. He was 62. He was heavier than he had been. The vigor that had once powered him through cabinet meetings and embassy dinners and the late-night conversations that were his particular pleasure was draining away, replaced by something that was not yet illness in any clinical sense, but was no longer the robust, expensive health of a man in command of his own body. He tired more easily. He ate less. The color in his face, which had once been the ruddy glow of a man who enjoyed life to its fullest, was becoming something else, something that Diana, who had watched him across dinner tables for 34 years, could read even when the doctors could not. His habits had not changed because habits at 62 do not change. The wine continued, the late nights continued. The appetite for company, for conversation, for the stimulation that came from being in a room full of intelligent people, all of it continued because to stop would have been to admit that the life was ending, and Duff was not a man who admitted endings until they arrived. He was still writing. He was still reading. He was still, in his diminished way, the most interesting man in any room he entered. But the rooms were smaller, and the man was smaller inside them, and the gap between what he had been and what he was becoming was visible to anyone who cared to look. Diana watched. She had been watching Duff for over 30 years, watching him charm rooms, watching him betray her, watching him resign on principle, watching him rebuild, watching him drink, watching him write, watching him age. She was by now an expert in the art of watching a man she loved do things she could not prevent. She knew his body better than he did, perhaps, because she observed it from the outside, without the distortions of self-regard that allowed Duff to believe he was still the man he had been. She saw the changes, she saw the weight, she saw the fatigue that settled over him at moments when, in earlier years, he would have been reaching for another glass and another hour of talk. The discipline she had learned at Belvoir, the discipline of silence and surface, and the refusal to make private grief a public spectacle, served her here as it had served her everywhere. She did not complain. She did not stage an intervention. Because interventions were not what women of her generation and class conducted. They endured. She maintained the household, the invitations, the garden, the life. She maintained the appearance that everything was proceeding as it should, because maintaining appearances was what she did. And because the alternative, admitting that the man who had been the fixed point of her adult life was slowly, visibly, irreversibly failing, was more than the code she had lived by would permit. The audience should feel at this point that the machinery of this story is approaching its destination. The castle still stands in Leicestershire, but the people who made it matter are aging in a house in France. The title has been conferred, but the title does not confer what titles once conferred. The name is still famous, but fame, without the structure that once gave it function, is just memory with better lighting. Everything Diana and Duff have been, the beauty and the politician, the hostess and the diplomat, the partnership that dazzled two countries and survived two wars and weathered infidelities and financial precariousness, and the destruction of the world that produced them, is now running in reserves. And the reserves are not infinite. What comes next is a ship, a winter crossing, and a death that will leave Diana Cooper at 61, alone with a name and a past, and the question of what exactly a woman does when the last person who shared her world is gone. The year 1953 began with the Viscountcy still fresh and the old life still, on the surface, intact. Duff and Diana were at Chantilly. The house was comfortable. The garden was maintained. The visitors still came, fewer than before and with less urgency, but they came. There were lunches and dinners and the small rituals of hospitality that Diana managed with the efficiency of a woman who had been managing rooms since she was old enough to understand that a room was a thing that could be managed. Duff was writing. He was working on a novel, though whether it was going well or poorly depended on the day and the hour and the amount of wine that had accompanied lunch. He was also reading, corresponding, maintaining the intellectual life that had always been his parallel existence alongside the political one. To an outside observer, arriving at Chantilly for a weekend in the early months of 1953, the scene would have looked like a graceful retirement. A distinguished man and his famous wife, living well in France, surrounded by books and beauty and the residue of a remarkable career. The outside observer would have been wrong. Or rather, the outside observer would have been seeing only what Diana wanted them to see, which was the whole point. The reality underneath the surface was darker and more precarious. Duff's health was deteriorating in ways that could no longer be disguised by good tailoring and the controlled atmosphere of a well-run house. The drinking had not stopped. It had, if anything, intensified, not in the dramatic, visible way that would have constituted a scandal, but in the steady, daily way that was simply how men of his generation and class lived. A glass of wine at lunch, a whiskey before dinner, claret with the meal, port afterwards, a nightcap. The quantities were not extraordinary by the standards of his world, but the body receiving them was no longer the body of a young man, and the cumulative effect across decades was becoming impossible to ignore. He was having digestive troubles. He was losing weight in ways that were not intentional. His color was wrong, not florid, as it had been in the years of robust excess, but something grayer, more uncertain, as though the system that had processed a lifetime of rich food and good wine was beginning to signal that it could no longer manage the load. Diana noticed. She noticed everything about Duff, because noticing was what she had done for 34 years. Noticing the affairs, noticing the absences, noticing the moments of brilliance and the moments of cruelty. Noticing the slow alteration of a man she had loved since she was young and who was now undeniably old. She noticed the changes in his body the way she noticed everything. Silently, carefully, without making a scene. The code held, it always held. You did not discuss a man's health at dinner. You did not turn private worry into public drama. You watched and you waited and you hoped that the doctor who had been consulted would say something reassuring. And if the doctor did not say something reassuring, you absorbed that too, because absorbing things was what you did. The spring and summer of 1953 passed in this way. The surface maintained, the worry underneath, the life continuing because stopping was not an option that either of them would have considered. Duff continued to entertain. He continued to write letters that were, by all accounts, still sharp, still funny, still the work of a mind that had not lost its edge even as the body that housed it was failing. He and Diana attended events, received friends, maintained the social calendar that was, by now, less a calendar than a habit. The habit of being the Coopers, of performing the roles they had played for so long that the roles had become indistinguishable from the people. There were moments during this period when the old magic flared. A dinner at which Duff was brilliant, holding the table with an anecdote about Talleyrand or Churchill or some episode from the embassy years that he told, with the timing and precision of a man who understood that a well-told story was worth more than a well-cooked meal. An evening when Diana made the room feel for an hour or two the way rooms had felt in the embassy years. Alive, purposeful, lit by a quality of attention that no amount of money could buy and that no one else in their circle could quite replicate. A lunch at which the couple sat together with the kind of companionable ease that comes from decades of shared experience, and the conversation moved between languages and subjects with the fluency that had always been their signature. And a visitor would have thought for a moment that nothing had changed, that the Coopers were still the Coopers, that the machine was still running. These moments were not false. They were real. The brilliance was real. The charm was real. The capacity for pleasure and the wit and the kind of conversation that made time disappear. All of it was still there, still available, still capable of producing an evening that anyone present would remember for years. But the moments were becoming islands rather than continents. They were surrounded increasingly by stretches of something else. Fatigue, discomfort, the quiet withdrawal of a man whose body was telling him what his habits would not let him hear. The light was there, the way light is there at the end of a long autumn afternoon. Beautiful, warm, and unmistakably fading. By the autumn of 1953, the fading had become difficult to deny. Duff's medical condition, and the precise nature of which the available biographical record describes in general terms rather than clinical specifics, was worsening. The digestive problems were more persistent, the fatigue was deeper, the appetite that had once been legendary for food, for wine, for company, for the sheer physical pleasure of being alive and conscious in a beautiful room, was diminished. There was increasingly a sense among the people closest to the couple that something was seriously wrong, that the decline was not merely the natural consequence of a man in his early 60s slowing down, but something more specific, more dangerous, and more urgent. Doctors were consulted, advice was given. Whether the advice was followed or whether Duff received it with the impatience of a man who had never been told what to do and was not about to start is not recorded in detail. Diana's letters from this period, to the extent that they have been published and quoted, carry the tone of a woman who is managing two things at once: the public performance of normality and the private apprehension of catastrophe. She was 61 years old. She had survived the annihilation of the Coterie, 2 world wars, her husband's serial infidelities, financial precariousness, social displacement, and the slow dismantling of the world that had produced her. She had survived all of it by maintaining the surface, by keeping the rooms beautiful, the conversation flowing, the appearance of control intact even when control was the last thing she possessed. Now the surface was being tested by something it could not charm or manage or arrange, the failure of a body that belonged to the person she had built her entire adult life around. There is a particular cruelty in watching someone you love decline when you are a person whose gift is management. Diana could manage a dinner party for 40. She could manage a diplomatic reception in a liberated capital. She could manage her own beauty, her own grief, her own loneliness, with a discipline that verged on the heroic. She could not manage Duff's blood vessels, his liver, his organs, the internal machinery of a body that had been run hard for 6 decades and was beginning to break down in ways that no hostess, however skilled, could repair with a well-placed flower arrangement and a change of seating plan. The helplessness must have been profound. Diana was not a woman who had much experience of helplessness. She had always been the one who acted, who arranged, who made things work. Now there was nothing to arrange except the pretense that everything was fine. The decision to travel by sea that winter and to board the French liner Colombie for a voyage that would take them from the south of France toward the Caribbean was not unusual. The Coopers had always traveled. Travel was part of the rhythm of their life, part of the performance of being the kind of people who move through the world with ease and purpose. A winter cruise was a reasonable thing for a retired diplomat and his wife to undertake. The weather in northern France was cold. The warmth of the tropics was appealing. The prospect of a few weeks at sea, away from the demands of the house and the social calendar and the accumulating weight of Duff's condition, must have seemed to Diana like a reprieve, a chance to rest, to recalibrate, to spend time with her husband in the particular privacy that a ship provides, where the world shrinks to the dimensions of a cabin and a deck, and the horizon and the people you are with. What Diana could not have known, what nobody could have known with certainty, though the signs were there for anyone trained to read them, was that the reprieve would become a crisis, and the crisis would become the event around which the rest of her life would be organized. The Colombie sailed in late December 1953. The ship was a passenger liner of the Compagnie Générale Transatlantique, the French line that had carried travelers across the Atlantic for generations. It was not the grandest vessel afloat, not a Cunard flagship, not one of the great floating palaces of the interwar era, but it was comfortable, reputable, and French, which mattered to the Coopers, who had spent the last decade living in France and who felt by now more at home on a French ship than on a British one. The couple boarded with the expectation of a voyage, a holiday, a few weeks of warmth and rest. Duff was 63 years old, Diana was 61. They had been married for 34 years. The first days of the voyage were, by the accounts that survive, unremarkable. The ship moved south through winter seas. The passengers settled into the rhythm of shipboard life, the meals, the promenades, the small sociabilities of a vessel carrying people who had paid for leisure and expected to find it. Duff and Diana occupied their cabin, dined, perhaps walked the deck in the brief intervals when the weather permitted. There is a particular quality to life at sea that should be noted here because it matters to what happened next. A ship is a closed world. It has its own doctor, its own routines, its own version of community. But it does not have a hospital. It does not have specialists. It does not have the resources that a city or even a small town can summon when a medical emergency occurs. What it has is a cabin, a ship's doctor, and the open water. On the night of the 31st of December 1953, as the year turned into 1954, Duff Cooper suffered a catastrophic hemorrhage. The precise medical sequence, the internal event that caused the bleeding, the exact time it began, the clinical details of what was happening inside his body, is not recorded in the public biographical literature with the specificity that a medical chart would provide. What is known is this: Duff was gravely ill. The bleeding was severe. It was sudden in the way that these things are sudden. Not a gradual worsening that could be managed and monitored, but a crisis that announced itself with the unmistakable authority of a body in failure. The ship's doctor was summoned, and Diana, in a cabin on a French liner somewhere in the North Atlantic, watched her husband enter a medical emergency that the ship had neither the equipment nor the expertise to manage. There is something about this setting that the documentary must render with absolute precision because the setting is the meaning. Duff Cooper had spent his life in rooms that were designed to impress, cabinet rooms in Whitehall, where the decisions that governed an empire were taken around a table that had seen centuries of power. The Admiralty, with its maps and its naval history and its quiet assertion that Britain ruled the waves. The Hôtel de Charost on the Rue du Faubourg Saint-Honoré, where the chandeliers and the moldings and the garden and the silverware all announced that this was a place where civilizations met. The great country houses of England, Belvoir, where Diana was born, and the dozens of others where they had been guests and where the architecture itself was an argument for the permanence of the class that built it. He had moved through spaces that announced, by their proportions and their furnishings and their history, that the people inside them were important, that what happened here mattered, that the world was paying attention. Now the space was a cabin on a ship. Small, functional. The walls were close. The ceiling was low. The light was the flat, unforgiving light of a shipboard lamp, not the warm glow of candles at an embassy dinner or the soft light of a reading lamp in the library at Chantilly, but the clinical illumination of a space designed for sleep and transit, not for living, and certainly not for dying. The furniture was built in and practical. The portholes showed nothing but the dark of the Atlantic night, and perhaps the reflection of the lamp and the two faces inside the cabin, one failing, one watching. The ship's doctor was competent, but working with the resources of a passenger vessel, not a hospital. There was no surgeon to call. There was no specialist to consult. There were no other options. There was only the ship, the sea, the cabin, and the sound of the engines carrying them forward through the dark water toward a destination that no longer mattered, because the only destination that mattered now was whether Duff would live or die, and that destination was not on any chart. Diana was with him. That much is certain. She was in the cabin, or she was summoned to it, and she was there when the crisis became clear, when the doctor's manner shifted from professional attention to something more guarded, when the language changed from treatment to management, to the kind of quiet, careful speech that medical professionals use when the situation has moved beyond what they can control. She was there as the ship's doctor worked, as the hours of New Year's Eve passed, as the night that in other years, in other settings, would have been marked with champagne and laughter, and the particular pleasure that the Coopers had always taken in celebration, became instead of vigil. Somewhere on the ship, other passengers were counting down to midnight. Somewhere, there were toasts and embraces and the small optimism that a new year is supposed to carry. In the cabin, there was none of that. There was a woman sitting with a man who was dying, and the extraordinary, devastating contrast between the celebration happening elsewhere on the vessel and the crisis happening here was not something Diana could have missed, because Diana never missed the arrangement of a room, and this room's arrangement was the cruelest she had ever occupied. The woman who had commanded the most famous drawing rooms in Europe was now in a space she could not command. The woman who had spent 60 years mastering the art of atmosphere, the arrangement of light and conversation, the placement of flowers and people, the management of how a room felt when you walked into it, was in a room where atmosphere was irrelevant, and the only things that mattered were a pulse and a breath and the quiet professional movements of a doctor who was doing his best in circumstances that made his best insufficient. Everything Diana had been trained to do, to charm, to arrange, to perform, to make beauty happen, was useless here. The only skill that applied was the one she had learned earliest and practiced longest, the skill of enduring what could not be changed. He did not survive. Alfred Duff Cooper, 1st Viscount Norwich of Aldwych, died aboard the Columbia on the 1st of January 1954. He was 63 years old. He had been a soldier, a politician, a cabinet minister, a dissenter, an ambassador, a writer, a lover, a drinker, and for 34 years, the husband of the most famous woman in England. He died at sea, between countries, in transit, in a space that belonged to neither the England that had formed him nor the France that had adopted him. The timing was cruelly precise. The old year ended and the new year began, and Duff Cooper died in the passage between them, as though the calendar itself were underlining the point that his life had been lived in the space between two worlds, the old world of aristocratic confidence and the new world that had replaced it, and that neither world had quite claimed him at the end. Diana was alone, not alone in the literal sense. There were passengers, crew, the ship's doctor, the administrative machinery of a death at sea that must be documented and reported and managed, but alone in the sense that mattered. The man who had been the other half of the performance was gone. The partnership that had structured her adult life, the partnership that had given her a role, a purpose, a reason to make rooms beautiful and dinners brilliant and the world turn on the axis of her attention, was over. She was 61 years old. She was on a ship in the Atlantic. Her husband was dead, and the year was one day old. The administrative aftermath of a death at sea is a particular kind of indignity, and it should be described here because the indignity is part of the meaning. There are forms to be completed. There are protocols to be observed. There is the question of the body, what to do with it, where to store it, or how to manage the logistics of mortality in a setting that is designed for pleasure in transit, not for grief and not for the dead. A ship has a doctor, but it does not have a mortuary in any meaningful sense. A ship has a captain who must make decisions about schedules and ports and the competing needs of the living and the recently deceased. The Columbia continued its voyage because ships do not stop for a single death, however significant the life had been. The sea does not accommodate mourning. The engines continue. The schedule holds. The dining room opens for breakfast the next morning. Diana had to remain on the vessel. She had to occupy the same spaces as passengers who were still on holiday, who were still eating their meals and walking the decks and reading their novels and doing all the things that people on winter cruises do. While in her cabin, or in whatever space the ship provided for a widow in the first hours of her bereavement, the absence was total and the reality had not yet been processed. She was alone on a ship full of strangers, in the middle of the Atlantic, with a dead husband and no one from her own world to share the weight. The friends were in London, in Paris, in the country houses that dotted the English countryside. John Julius was in England, or wherever his own young life had taken him. The network of support that would gather around a widow of Diana's position, the solicitors, the friends, the family, the institutional machinery of condolence and arrangement, was thousands of miles away. For the duration of the voyage, Diana Cooper was as alone as she had ever been. The body was eventually returned to England. The arrangements were made, then the kind of arrangements that require telegrams and telephone calls and the coordination of bureaucracies across borders, the kind of arrangements that someone has to manage while also managing the first numbing days of grief. The burial was at Belvoir. The castle in Leicestershire where Diana had been born, the seat of the Rutland family, the place where the manors line had laid its dead for centuries amid the vale and the fields and the old stone that had witnessed so many arrivals and departures that one more, however painful, was absorbed into the continuity of the place. Duff was not a manors by blood. He had married into the family, and the family, whatever its private reservations about the brilliant, difficult, unfaithful man their daughter had chosen 34 years earlier, understood that this was where he belonged. Diana wanted him there. That was enough. He was buried among the manors line in the ground of the estate that had been the first fact of Diana's existence, and the burial closed a circle that had been opening since 1919, when a duke's daughter had married against her mother's wishes and had spent 3 decades proving that the marriage, for all its pain, for all its betrayals, for all its financial precariousness, and its public brilliance and its private agonies, had been the defining act of her life. The funeral was private. The public tributes were generous, as tributes to public men tend to be. Churchill, who was himself in the final years of his last premiership and who had valued Duff not merely as an ally but as a man who had been right when it mattered, paid his respects. The obituaries noted the career, the cabinet posts, the Munich resignation that had cost him office and earned him history's vindication, the embassy years, the books. They noted more carefully and with the circumspection that the period demanded the marriage, the partnership that had been one of the most visible in English public life, and that was now in the space of a single night at sea dissolved. What they did not note, because obituaries are not the place for such admissions, was the private cost, the infidelities endured, the financial anxieties absorbed, the decades of performance that had sustained the public image at the expense of the private woman who maintained it. And then Diana did something that the documentary should treat as the story's final act of self-authorship, because that is precisely what it was. She dropped the title. She ceased to be Viscountess Norwich. She reverted deliberately, publicly, and with the kind of quiet certainty that admits no argument, to the name she had carried before the viscountcy was conferred, and in truth, before the marriage itself had given her a surname that was not the one the public knew. She became once again Lady Diana Cooper, the name she had been born adjacent to, the name she had made famous through 60 years of performance, the name that carried the full weight of everything she had been: beauty, hostess, actress, wife, survivor, the woman who had held rooms together and held herself together and held an entire social world together by the sheer force of her will and her bone structure and her refusal to let the performance stop. The decision was small in administrative terms and enormous in symbolic ones. A viscountess outranks a lady in the formal hierarchy of the peerage. The protocol books are clear on this point. Diana chose the lower rank because the lower rank was the one that worked. Viscountess Norwich was a title that had existed for less than 2 years, that meant nothing to the public, that sounded, as she herself observed with characteristic precision, like porridge, and that connected her to a world of hereditary precedents that had already lost most of its power to determine how people were actually addressed and actually known. Lady Diana Cooper was a name that meant everything. It was the name that had been on the playbills for the Miracle in New York and London and every city in between. It was the name that had headed the guest list to the embassy in Paris. It was the name that Evelyn Waugh had written to, that the young men of the Coterie had loved, that the photographers had chased from ballroom to garden party to premiere across 3 decades of English social life. It was the name that carried the history. It was, in every sense that mattered, hers. And in choosing to return to it after Duff's death, she was making a statement that the documentary should not overlook, because it is the statement that ties the entire narrative together. The name she controlled was more powerful than the name the crown had conferred. The authority she had built through a lifetime of performance and survival, and the careful management of how the world saw her, was not dependent on a husband, a title, or a system that had long since ceased to function as it once had. She had outlived the husband. She had outlived the system. She had not outlived the name, because the name was the thing she had made, and making things, making rooms, making dinners, making an evening feel like something worth remembering, making a name feel like something worth carrying, was what she had always been best at. She was Lady Diana Cooper. She was 61 years old. She was a widow. She was alone in a way she had never been before, not merely without a husband, but without the role that the husband had provided, the structure that the partnership had sustained, the daily purpose that had organized her life since 1919. The embassy was someone else's, the cabinet was someone else's, Chantilly was a house for 2 people, and now it held one. The friends who had filled the rooms of her world were aging and dying in their own houses, on their own timelines, and the rooms themselves were emptying with a slowness that was almost worse than a sudden loss, because it allowed you to notice each absence individually, to feel each departure as a specific subtraction from a world that was already running on less than it needed. The question that hangs over the final act of this story is simple and unanswerable in any neat way. If the husband is gone, if the offices are gone, if the embassy is gone, if the old world that made all of it matter is gone, what exactly is Diana Cooper now? A relic of a vanished order? A performer without a stage? A witness whose testimony only matters if someone writes it down? Or something else entirely? A woman who, having survived the death of her world, is about to do the one thing that the code she was raised by never anticipated. She is going to write it down, she is going to publish it, and she is going to turn the act of remembering into the last and most durable form of the power she had always exercised. The answer would take 32 years to unfold. Diana Cooper would live until 1986. She would live to be 93 years old. And the decades between Duff's death and her own would prove to be not a postscript, but a final act. One in which the woman who had spent her life making rooms beautiful would turn at last to the more solitary and more lasting work of making sense of what the rooms had meant. The first year of widowhood was the hardest, not because Diana fell apart, but because she did not. The code held. It had always held. She rose in the morning, she dressed, she managed the house at Chantilly, which was now a house for one person and a staff that was smaller than it had once been, and she maintained the routines that had structured her life for decades. The letters, the meals, the garden, the small social obligations that continued because stopping them would have required an admission that she was not merely bereaved but broken, and Diana Cooper was not going to give the world or herself that satisfaction. The performance went on. It went on without an audience, or with a smaller one, but it went on because performing was what she knew how to do, and because the alternative, sitting still in a quiet house in France and letting the silence fill the rooms that Duff had once filled with talk and laughter and the smell of wine and tobacco, was not something the discipline of Belvoir had prepared her to accept. She was not, however, the same woman who had entered the marriage in 1919. She was not the beauty of the Coterie, not the star of the miracle, not the embassy hostess who had made the Hôtel de Charros feel like the center of European civilization. She was a widow in her 60s, living in France, increasingly far from the centers of power and publicity that had sustained her public identity for 40 years. The friends were thinning. The generation that had known her at her peak, that had danced with her before the First World War, that had dined with her in Paris after the Second, was aging and dying at the rate that generations do, and each death subtracted not just a person but a witness, someone who had known the world as Diana had known it and who could confirm by their presence that it had actually existed. What Diana did with this diminished world was remarkable, and it is the reason the documentary does not end with Duff's death, but continues for another 32 years. She wrote, not immediately, not easily, and not without the particular struggle of a woman who had spent her life in performance and conversation rather than in solitary composition. Writing was a different discipline from hosting. It required sitting alone in a room, something Diana had spent 60 years avoiding, and confronting on the page the gap between the version of the past she wanted to preserve and the version she had actually lived. But she did it. She did it with the same determination she had brought to everything else in her life, the same refusal to be defeated by circumstances that should, by any reasonable accounting, have defeated her. Her 3-volume autobiography, The Rainbow Comes and Goes, The Light of Common Day, and Trumpets from the Steep, appeared across the late 1950s and early 60s, and together they constitute one of the most vivid and revealing memoirs of the British upper class in the first half of the 20th century. The first volume carried the reader from Belvoir and the world before the Great War, through the annihilation of the Coterie and the raw, grieving years that followed. The second took the story through the marriage, the miracle, the interwar years, and the slow construction of the Cooper partnership. The third brought it through the war, the embassy, and the death of Duff. The prose was witty, controlled, and marked by the same quality that Diana brought to everything she did, the ability to make the personal feel important without making it feel inflated. She wrote about great events as though they were intimate anecdotes, and about intimate moments as though they carried the weight of history. And the effect was a memoir that read not like a public figure's official account, but like a private conversation with someone who had been everywhere, known everyone, and understood that the meaning of a life lay not in its grand occasions, but in the texture of its ordinary days. The memoirs were not confessional in the modern sense. Diana did not bare her soul. She did not dissect her marriage with the ruthlessness that a later generation of memoirists would have considered obligatory. She did not write about Duff's infidelities with anything approaching the frankness that the subject, if fully explored, would have demanded. What she did was something more characteristic of her class and her temperament she curated. She selected the details that served the story she wanted to tell. A story of beauty, adventure, loss, resilience, and the particular kind of English life that was already, by the time she was writing, becoming historical rather than current. The silences in the memoirs are as revealing as the disclosures. What Diana chose not to say about Duff's other women, about the financial anxieties that had stalked the marriage from its earliest years, about the private cost of the public performance. Then those omissions are not failures of honesty. They are the last expression of the code that had governed her life since childhood. You did not discuss certain things, not because they did not matter, but because discussing them would have violated the compact that held the whole structure together. Even in writing, even in the privacy of composition, even when the only audience was a publisher and a reading public that would never know what had been left out, Diana maintained the surface. The surface was, in the end, her masterpiece. The books were well received. They were reviewed with the respect due to a woman of Diana's standing and with the affection due to a writer whose voice was genuinely distinctive. They were not bestsellers in the modern sense. The market for aristocratic memoirs was substantial, but not vast, but they entered the permanent record. They became sources for biographers, reference points for historians, and most importantly, the version of the story that Diana chose to leave behind. That matters because it means the old ruling class lost its political authority, lost its social centrality, lost most of its economic power, but kept one thing: the ability to write its own history. Diana's memoirs are an exercise in that final authority. She decided what the public would know. She decided what would be remembered. She decided in prose that was elegant and selective and careful what the name Lady Diana Cooper would mean to posterity. It was her last great act of room management, conducted not in a drawing room but on the page. Diana also became, in her later decades, a figure of a particular kind of London social life, the kind that exists after the official structures have fallen away and what remains is personality, reputation, and the willingness to go on being interesting in a world that no longer requires your particular brand of interest. She returned to London eventually, settling in a house in Little Venice, in a part of the city that was quieter and less grand than the Mayfair and Belgravia addresses of her youth, but that suited the reduced scale of her later life. The house was not large, it did not need to be. Diana no longer required the kind of space that embassy entertaining demanded. What she required was a room that she could make her own. And she made it her own with the same instinct for atmosphere that she had exercised since childhood. Books, flowers, objects collected across 6 decades of a life, lived in beautiful places. The accumulated evidence of a woman who had always understood that how a room looked was not vanity, but identity. She received visitors with the same attentiveness she had brought to the embassy, though the rooms were smaller and the guest list was no longer vetted for diplomatic utility. The visitors were writers, old friends whose numbers diminished with each passing year, younger people drawn to the legend and curious about the woman behind it, and the occasional journalist seeking an interview with someone who had known everyone from Churchill to War to the abdicated king. She was not a recluse. She was not withdrawn. She was, in her late 70s and 80s, a woman who still wanted company, still wanted conversation, still wanted the particular stimulation that came from being in a room with someone interesting. But the rooms were smaller now, and the company was rarer, and the world outside the house in Little Venice was increasingly a world she did not recognize and did not pretend to understand. She had been born in the reign of Queen Victoria. She was living through the age of Margaret Thatcher. The distance was not merely temporal, it was civilizational. The Paris Review published a long interview with her conducted by Shusha Guppy, and the transcript reveals a woman who is still witty, still precise, still capable of the kind of observation that makes you stop and reread the sentence to make sure you caught everything. She speaks about her parents, about the Coterie, about Duff, about the embassy, about the war, about Waugh, with a clarity that belies her age and a selectiveness that confirms it. She knows what she wants to say. She knows equally what she does not want to say. The interview is charming and guarded in equal measure, which is to say, it is exactly like Diana herself. A surface so polished that it reflects the interviewer's questions back at them, revealing only what the subject has chosen to reveal. She lived to be 93. She died in London on the 16th of June, 1986, more than 32 years after Duff, in a world that bore almost no resemblance to the one she had been born into. The British Empire had dissolved. The great houses had been sold, demolished, or converted into heritage attractions. The season survived as a social calendar for a diminished circle, rather than as the organizing structure of a ruling class. The peerage had been reformed, reduced and largely stripped of its political function. The code of silence that had governed her entire life, the code that said you did not discuss paternity or infidelity or money or the gap between the public version and the private truth, had been replaced in the decades after her death by a culture of confession and exposure that would have appalled every instinct she possessed. She had outlived not just her husband and her friends, but the entire set of assumptions that had made her life legible to the people who lived it. John Julius Norwich. He had by then dropped the Cooper and taken the territorial designation as his working name, in the manner of writers who understand that a name is a professional tool as much as a personal inheritance, became one of the principal forms in which the dynasty mutated rather than ended. He inherited the Viscountcy in 1954 at the age of 24, inheriting along with it a title that connected him to the most dramatic political resignation of the interwar period and to the most celebrated embassy posting of the postwar. He carried the title for the rest of his life, but the title was never the important thing about him. What was important was the work. His books on Venice, a 2-volume history that combined deep archival scholarship with narrative elegance and a gift for making the remote feel immediate, became standard references and popular successes. His histories of Byzantium, published across the 1990s, reached audiences far beyond the Academy and established him as one of those rare historians who could write for specialists and general readers simultaneously without condescending to either. He wrote about the Normans in Sicily, about the popes, about the Mediterranean, about Shakespeare's kings, about subjects that combined his father's political intelligence with his mother's gift for making a room or a page feel alive with personality and purpose. He became a broadcaster, a lecturer, a public intellectual of the kind that Britain produces when old money cultivation meets genuine talent and the willingness to work. He also became, over decades, one of the chief custodians of his parents' legacy. He edited Duff's diaries for publication, the diaries that Duff had kept throughout his political and diplomatic career, recording in private the thoughts and observations that could not be expressed in public, and that constitute one of the most valuable insider accounts of British political life from the 1920s to the 1950s. He compiled and published collections of Diana's letters, including the Darling Monster correspondence, the wartime letters that Diana had written to him as a child evacuee, the records of a family whose private communication turned out to be as vivid and as historically valuable as any official archive in the kingdom. The work of curation was not neutral. It was an act of authorship in its own right. John Julius chose what to include and what to leave out, what to annotate and what to let stand, without comment, and in doing so he shaped the version of his parents that posterity would know. He did it with care, with love, with scholarly scruple, and with the particular understanding of a man who had grown up inside the legend and knew, better than anyone, the distance between the legend and the life. The cultural afterlife of the Coopers is stronger in print than on screen. No major film or television drama has taken Lady Diana Cooper as its central subject, a fact that says something about the nature of her story, which is interior, cumulative, and resistant to the kind of single, dramatic arc that screen adaptations require. What exists instead is a literary afterlife of exceptional richness. Diana's correspondence with Evelyn Waugh, voluminous, witty, and preserved by the kind of archival care that literary estates receive when the correspondents are sufficiently famous, survives as one of the great epistolary records of the mid-20th century. Waugh immortalized Diana as Mrs. Stitch, the character who reappears across his novels as a woman of devastating social command, capable of arranging anything and charming anyone into submission. Mrs. Stitch was not a portrait in the simple sense. She was a literary distillation of what Waugh saw when he looked at Diana, the magnificence, the mechanism, and the question of whether the magnificence could survive the disappearance of the world that had given it meaning. The letters between them are funnier, more intimate, and more revealing than the fiction, and they survive in the care of the National Heritage Memorial Fund as part of the cultural record too. The Churchill Archives Centre at Cambridge holds the Cooper papers. The letters, the diaries, the photographs, the accumulated documentary evidence of two lives lived at the intersection of politics, diplomacy, literature, and the British social elite. The archive is not a relic. It is a working resource, consulted by scholars and biographers, and it ensures that the Cooper story continues to be told not from memory, but from evidence. The papers have been processed, catalogued, and made accessible with the care that institutional archives bring to collections of genuine historical importance. John Julius Norwich died on the 20th of June 2018 at the age of 88. He had been, for 64 years, the second Viscount Norwich. He left behind a body of work that had earned its own reputation independent of his parents' fame, and a family that continued the line into a world his mother would not have recognized. His daughter-in-law, Artemis Cooper, herself a writer and biographer of considerable distinction, the author of books on wartime Cairo, on Patrick Leigh Fermor, and on the world that surrounded the Cooper family, had already done essential work in preserving and interpreting the family archive. Her editorial contributions, her biographical knowledge, and her own books on wartime and post-war Europe made her one of the crucial posthumous custodians of the Cooper legacy. She understood, as John Julius had understood, that the family's survival now depended on the written word, on the careful, deliberate transformation of private memory into public record. She remains active as a writer and editor, a living connection to a family whose story spans from the Victorian aristocracy to the present day. The Viscountcy itself continues. Jason Charles Duff Bede Cooper is the third Viscount Norwich, his succession confirmed by the House of Lords. He carries a name that connects him to a man who resigned over Munich, a woman who dazzled liberated Paris, and a grandfather who wrote the history of Venice. Whether the connection is a weight or a gift is a question that only the bearer can answer, and it is not a question the documentary needs to resolve. What it needs to note is simpler. The title survives. The political substance that once accompanied it does not. Belvoir Castle remains the seat of the Duke of Rutland. It stands above the Vale in Leicestershire, as it has stood for centuries, its Gothic revival silhouette still visible for miles, its grounds still beautiful, its rooms still magnificent. But it is no longer the unquestioned command center of a ruling family. It is a heritage property, open to the public, maintained not by the unearned income of a great agricultural estate, but by the revenue of visitors who come to see how the old order once lived. The rooms that Diana grew up in, the drawing rooms where Violet held court in cultivated atmosphere, the corridors where whispers about paternity and infidelity once traveled with the discretion that only servants' quarters could guarantee, the staircases that told you where you stood in a hierarchy that everyone understood and nobody discussed, are now walked by tourists with cameras and audio guides, and families on bank holiday outings, school children on history trips. The house that once assumed it owned history is now a museum of its own past. The transformation is not tragic exactly. It is the natural consequence of a democracy that decided, slowly and without violence, that the wealth and authority concentrated in houses like Belvoir should be redistributed, taxed, and democratized. The Manors family adapted. They opened the house. They found new sources of income. They did what the surviving aristocratic families learned to do in the second half of the 20th century. They converted. Land became heritage. Authority became hospitality. The private house became the public attraction. Diana Cooper's life reveals something harsher than nostalgia and more interesting than decline. The British aristocracy did not simply disappear, and it did not quite endure in the form it had assumed for centuries. It learned to convert itself. Houses became heritage attractions. Titles became curiosities, decorative rather than functional. Influence became hosting, writing, editing, remembering, and softer forms of power exercised in smaller rooms. Diana was born into a system that believed beauty, rank, and access were permanent facts, as solid as the stone of Belvoir, and as enduring as the family name carved above its gate. By the time she died, in 1986 and 93, those facts had become costumes. Elaborate, beautiful, historically significant costumes that only worked if someone still knew how to wear them. She did. She wore them longer and better and with more conviction than almost anyone else of her generation. And the name she chose at the end, after the titles and the offices and the embassies and the husband were gone, Lady Diana Cooper, not Viscountess Norwich, not the daughter of a duke, not the widow of a statesman, but the name the public knew and the name she had made, was the last costume of all and the one that fit best, because it was the one she had sewn herself.